Good afternoon, everyone. I am here with Noura, my co-host, and this is for Politics in the Time of Corona for Status Al-Wada' podcast. And we are joined today by the lovely Amr Adli from Cairo, who will be informing us about what is going on in Cairo regarding, and Egypt perhaps, regarding this pandemic. And even though this topic is quite gloomy, you might find some laughter here and there to just keep us alive and keep us going. So welcome, Amr, to the podcast, and we are very happy to have you.
اهلا
هاي
وسهلا عامر.
أسامة، أهلا وسهلا فيكم.
Amr, let's start with first telling us how have you been personally coping, you and the family, with this pandemic in Cairo. There's very little news about Cairo, by the way, at the same time that we know that there's a lot going on.
Okay. Well, good thing there's so little news so far. Okay, that's not necessarily a bad thing. We have been locked down at home, more or less, but it's self-enforced so far because there's only a partial lockdown in Egypt. So a curfew was imposed by the government almost 2 days ago. But before that, because I teach at a university, most campuses were closed a couple of weeks earlier. So that was the beginning of experiencing somehow of a lockdown. And that was, of course, something that happened with the rising number of cases reported by the government. All of the hearsay that you have about people that are sick or places that are too risky to go to. So I have been basically spending most of my time at home in the past couple of weeks with my son, who's 7-year-old and who is no longer going to school because schools closed on the same day with like universities. And that is apparently the case with, I don't know, 2.2 billion people around the globe. So it's a very strange case of sense of solidarity, I would say, that you just call people that live in other continents and then you discover that they are sharing the same daily routine with you at home, which is quite strange.
طيب.
I teach online well, and that's it. So, which is, I think, is what you do as well. So this is the new normal. I hope it won't be for a prolonged period of time, but well,
Absolutely.
we hope for the best.
We do the same thing, except that our kid is 6, not 7, and we teach from home, and it's practically the same thing, and that does provide some sort of solidarity, solace, and so on, as we actually describe in the blurb for the show. One of the reasons we're doing this is because we know that, or we think that, the common experience empowers all of us during these difficult times. طيب, شكرا عمرو. Let me go on to ask you about the basic statistics and environment and developments in Egypt regarding the pandemic. As you said, there's not much going on, as I said as well, and that's good news. But we know little. Actually, when we were even trying to do some research on Cairo and Egypt, we were hard-pressed to find what we could find, for instance, even on Gaza and other places. So if you can give us an overview before we get into the politicization, that would be fantastic.
So the main source of data remains the government. There are, of course, very deep-seated doubts about the accuracy of these, which are quite normal, not only on authoritarian context like that of Egypt, but I think they are normal given the limited capacities of many states in the global south. So this pandemic now is moving apparently into countries in the global south, and these are states that have limited capacities on all fronts. Not only that they have less efficient healthcare systems, or as a matter of fact, some of them don't even have healthcare systems they will just have them in name, but also in all other institutional capacities, including information gathering, processing, etc. So that is something that makes people doubt some of the figures. I am not very trustworthy in general, as I was saying. It's not that I trust all that the government says. I don't think that they are that trustworthy, but I don't think that they have any reason to suppress the data or to claim that things are not or are better than they are actually. Because on the one hand, it would be extremely hard to conceal if there is an outbreak. This is what we have witnessed, not only in Iran nowadays, which is a totalitarian regime that is much better in control of everything compared to that in Egypt, and one that has been managing better under pressure in the past couple of years. Yet they could not conceal it more than a couple of days. But also that applies to China even, which is like nowadays the best of all authoritarian regimes that we have in the world. Like one that everybody here in that not very happy part of the world looks up to. That this is an authoritarian regime that could actually like vanquish Corona using very authoritarian measures that applied to, I don't know, 900 million or 800 million people. So even there, they could not concede. So I don't think that we are having an outbreak. I don't think that the government is really concealing anything on purpose. I think that they have limited capacities, and for that matter, it's something that is quite common across the global south. I converse with friends of mine in other North African countries, even in Latin America, not to mention South Asia. And I think that if this thing really proves to spread despite the rising heat in the most populated parts of the global south, then we will be very deep. The bulk of humanity does not reside in states that have outstanding capacities in order to grapple with such an affliction. My concern. Everybody, I think, at least in my circles, but even people that are not directly in my circles, follow up the news very closely. There are hopes. People are very hopeful that eventually the heat, something that is quite detestable in Egypt usually, but people are very much looking forward to having some of the heat waves that we usually complain about in April and in March, when like suddenly the temperature rises to 38 or 40. Then people are looking forward to these. People are, especially the ones who can read English and follow up some of the Western media, are like developing this sudden interest in scientific research that is covered in newspapers about how heat, humidity, different latitudes and altitudes and all of this stuff, and how it is likely to help in containing this virus, because we know it's quite serious for everything like this to happen at the same time, especially because nobody's going to be paying attention to whatever is happening in other countries if everything goes down the drain simultaneously in at least like 2/3 of the globe. Now with East Asia hopefully emerging out of this pandemic, hopefully I'm saying. So I don't know. These are times really that like sometimes I reflect a bit on them. These are very, very anxious times, very, very anxious times. And part of the anxiety, of course, is not only the pandemic that is now a pandemic because of globalization to a great extent. The very idea that you have something that develops in Central Asia and makes it to the rest of the world in less than 15 weeks, which is very, very dramatic, definitely. Also, all of the very ominous news that we are having about the economy is another reminder about globalization as a point of weakness to a great extent. But also, I think, social media, media more generally, not only the social media, is one that is keeping us very much anxious. I'm not saying that this is their fault, but I'm just saying that these are very anxious times in general. It's not that the pandemic is causing them to be anxious. It's just that we are anxious, I don't know, beings as modern humans, most probably. And
Ahmed,
that's
before we
the
continue to delve deeper into the economy and other, sources of anxiety, I wanted to just focus just a little bit more on Egypt's response. So you
yes.
mentioned that there's self-isolation that's been imposed at the university and the school levels. I imagine these might be private schools, but in the other, several African states, including South Africa, have sealed their borders. And are not allowing travel in order to prevent the virus from entering. Is there anything on the horizon in Egypt to do the same, at least until we're able to contain, to track where this is happening?
They have already done so a couple of weeks ago by basically closing the airports. We don't receive any flights anymore. We don't send flights anymore. And this ban got extended for another 2 weeks yesterday by a decision by the minister. So the country is quite isolated from the rest of the world. And this, of course, has to do with the strong South European links that we have had with regards to trade, investment, and tourism. And that's why you had mainly European tourists were the ones that had corona. And this was the first cluster that was discovered a month ago in Aswan, which is quite interesting because this is a touristic area that is very much to the south of Egypt. Other land borders are not that significant. Like unlike South Africa, we don't have these big flows over land borders. We have some trade with Sudan, but it's not that big. Egypt is a hub. It's not a very big hub, by the way, compared to Turkey or Dubai, but it is in Africa. And as I was saying, there has always been this big traffic between Asia and Europe through Egypt. So they sealed this. All schools, public as well as private, all schools, all campuses, all of these were closed a couple of weeks ago. You had the mosques as well as churches being completely closed a bit less than a week ago. So the last Friday was the last Friday sermon to be held. Tomorrow is going to be the first Friday when no Friday prayers are going to be held at all. The government is trying to and then you have a curfew, of course, that was imposed, according to which people are not allowed to go out as of 7 p.m. All malls, shops, restaurants, all of these are closed during weekends. Tomorrow is going to be the first weekend where nothing is going to be open with the exception of bakeries, pharmacies, and like mainly supermarkets and markets, like grocery shops. And all government offices are closed as well, by the way, with the exception of health facilities. So I think they are trying to do their homework, by the way. I think so. I think that they are trying to do their best. Whether this is going to work or not is not very clear. But what applies to Egypt applies to many other countries. The issue, of course, got politicized because like this pandemic happened in a certain political context. So definitely part of not having enough trust in the government stems from the kind of political struggle or strife that Egypt witnessed since 2013. And also there has been some, I would say some misinformation, by the way, on some websites, on some social media pages. And I think that this had a very overt political.
Like what?
Well, you have people that are antagonistic to the current regime that we're having in Egypt, and they are the ones that keep saying that there is an outbreak and the government is trying to cover up on it. They are trying to. Sometimes even you have fake videos about people that are falling in the street, or about hospitals that are receiving so many people. Sometimes even they are so badly done. But I think that it's in some instances, given the sensitivity of information circulation nowadays, I think that it's quite malicious. Because that's the only means through which some collective action could be done, that you coordinate with a population of 100 million through flows of information. And as I was saying, it's not that people trust each other or trust the state that much. And hence, when you have this misinformation, it is a problem. It's a problem in other places as well. But in each country, you have, of course, its specific recent historical context to an extent.
عمرو انت قلت you said 100 million امتى حصل ده 100 million انا يعني this is a side question انتوا وصلتوا اسم الله
we have yes we do this, yes, all the time.
Also universal, Amr. Also universal.
Not really. I think that this is well, it's quite Egyptian, and it's Africa more generally.
لا وخاصة هلا بالكورنتين يعني
even the Arab world.
هذا اسمه حجر صحي.
Definitely. You had almost like a couple of millions of Egyptians were born during the curfew of 2013. And people have very big concerns about the same happening if we end up in the same thing. Yeah?
لا إن شاء الله خير إن شاء الله خير. طب عمرو, before we go on,
yes.
Can you let us know a little bit more about the statistics that you feel are valid, when يعني especially in terms of the rate of growth and spread, if not the actual numbers that are inflicted today?
Well, the thing is that, of course, I think you need an epidemiologist on the one hand and a statistician on the other to tell you about the estimates, because clearly official figures are not representative of the total number of those infected by the virus. That's a rule everywhere in the world. So you always have an estimate because of the people that are asymptomatic or whatever. Like I'm just saying here what I hear in the news, by the way. I'm just like following it by heart. It's not that I know anything independently of what you have circulating around. I think that of course, as far as I understand, the Ministry of Health in Egypt is targeting, they are running all of these tests, but they are not apparently random tests. They are mainly targeting suspected clusters, because the main route through which coronavirus found its way into Egypt was by mixing up with either foreigners or Egyptians that had just come back from either the Gulf or Southern Europe. And here it's extremely interesting from a political economy perspective that you have these very dense links between the Nile Delta and people residing in Italy primarily. And many of these people, like Egyptians that have worked in Italy for years, many of them have fled Italy with the spread of coronavirus, and they ended up in Egypt. And some of them were infected, of course. And this is how some of the clusters in the rural parts of the Delta even started. So they are going after these people and after the people that they mingled with. And as I was saying, so far people are hopeful, and I'm here talking as a layman reporting on other laymen. So people are hopeful that this thing has been around for some time now in Egypt. It was discovered just a couple of days after the first case was spotted in Italy. It was discovered a bit before in the US, and we haven't had an outbreak yet. Of course, part of it is that we don't have the same ability to test. And that's why, that's one of the reasons why we don't have all of these cases. But on the other, as I was saying, again, if you are having a nasty outbreak, we will know about it, especially that the social media is still there. You have around 50 million Egyptians out of the 100 million. There are 100 million of us now. You have 50 million Egyptians that have access to the social media. And many people are addicted to it. They post whatever. So if this happens, we will know about it, I mean. So in that sense, I think that people are quite anxious about such an outbreak because there are big doubts. about the ability to contain such a thing if it goes out of control in a country like Egypt, so dense. Urban areas are extremely dense, and without a well-developed healthcare system at all. Especially if you take into consideration that a country like Italy is overwhelmed, and Italy has a formidable healthcare system. I lived in that country. I tried the healthcare there, and especially in the north, by the way, it's a very well-established, well-funded, well-manned system. And for it to be overwhelmed the way we are seeing so tragically is bodes very bad for the countries in the southern Mediterranean, as well as the other countries in the global south, who don't have a semblance even of what is there in Italy.
Thank you.
In terms of, so you've identified that these clusters are now in the rural areas in the Nile Delta. So is the government trying to then impose, so it's similar to what South Korea did, which was to contain it and then to contain regions. Has there been any government response in that way?
Well, not only in the Delta, by the way, because according to the Ministry of Health, almost 20, like they have cases in 24 governorates in Egypt, and Egypt only has 29 governorates. So they are already everywhere. But the point, like the strategy, as far as I understand, is for them to locate the people that had just made it from abroad and to isolate them as quickly as possible. That's what they are trying to do. It's very
Amr, the last 30 seconds were cut off.
Okay.
Sorry.
No problem.
I think it's because of the 100 million.
Yes, exactly. One more joined them. Yes. Mm-hmm. Okay.
That was a nice laugh. Okay, طيب, no, yours, not mine. Can you just try to repeat? Unfortunately, we can't tell you exactly when it got cut off.
We were at 24 out of 29 governorates that are inflicted.
The Ministry of Health, cases were spotted in 24 out of the 29 governorates in Egypt. So basically, they found people everywhere. But that overall number is still limited. We are still in like officially we have around 450 cases with 21 deaths, and this thing has been going on now for almost 5 to. So the strategy is for them to go after these people, to isolate them in quarantine hospitals, and they have several of them all around, and that's it. But the strategy here is very different from that of South Korea, because South Korea has a health system that enabled them to do testing for hundreds of thousands of citizens. These were random tests that they did, and in that case, as far as I understand, South Korea stands out together with Singapore and Hong Kong, countries that could reduce significantly the rate of spread of the virus without having a total lockdown. And that's why they are the ones, by the way, that not China. They are the ones that could do it in an economically sustainable way. And if we are to learn anything, it would be learning from them rather than from China. But of course, so many countries have the same capacities as these countries. So it's much easier to go the Chinese way, especially with countries that have a very big population. They don't have the like these institutional capacities to do so. They only have thumbs, no fingers.
عمرو, two things. أول شيء شكرا كتير for your time and the insight that you have shared with us. We are actually trying to wrap up in about 25 minutes. But in your case, the 25 minutes with you is like 30 or 32 because of your the rate of intellectual production via your oral sharing of all this information. So before we get interrupted again, once again, we would like to wrap up. So Noura has one final question, and then we will leave it to you to answer this question and share with us anything that you feel. And I don't know where to look anymore.
هون لما عم تسأله هناك لما عم يحكي.
You probably don't see this, but there's a big screen to our right. So Noura will ask one final question, and you can share with us anything that you feel was either not asked or that you feel you should share with us.
So here's my question, Ahmed. I think it would be so sad if we didn't ask you for an economic analysis about what's happening. I mean, you already mentioned that the South Korean model, for example, was more economically sustainable. But we didn't touch on at this point in Egypt, for example, as there has been shutdown of universities, schools, restaurants, malls. Are there ideas of subsidizing those industries? What is the government economic response to the crisis?
So the government has responded by preparing a stimulus package of around 100 billion Egyptian pounds, which is the equivalent of $6 or $7 billion, and they already of days ago. Key or crucial sector.
Amr, we're also getting interrupted, which was one of the reasons I wanted us to wrap up. Can you repeat that as much as you can?
We heard you up until it's the equivalent of $5 to $6 billion, and then you cut off.
Okay. So the government has already released some information about how this money will be used. Of course, you have some money that will be flowing to the healthcare system, but others are going to go to support the stock market, like mainly companies that are publicly traded there, as well as the real estate and construction sector, because this is quite central in pulling the economy, or at least preventing the economy from falling into recession. I think that the main challenge is not with these big industries, because the crisis in Egypt, as well as elsewhere in the world, will lead to an economic contraction. There is no doubt about it. There's no escape from this. Especially that some of the sectors, like tourism, that we had finally witnessed a comeback of, is nowadays non-existent in Egypt as well as in the world more generally. So, however, which constitutes something between 40 and 50% of Egypt GDP, and that hosts around 70% of total the total workforce in Egypt, as laborers, as self-employed, as household.
You said something constitutes XYZ. What is that something? Because you got cut off.
Yes, the main problem, I think, is with economic informality. That is the main social challenge, which constitutes between 40 and 50% of the total GDP in Egypt, as well as around 70% of the total workforce, either as informal workers, as self-employed, as household enterprises. And of course, this is an informal, irregular, unorganized sector. People that depend pretty much on generating income or receiving some form of wage on daily basis. So it's quite challenging in the Global South more generally to reach out to these people. I think that Egypt has some good infrastructure when it comes to food subsidies, because we have a long history with food subsidy provision in Egypt. And possibly this can be a good institutional infrastructure that they can capitalize on to reach out to these people in the short term. But I don't think that any of the countries, if you think of India, Indonesia, Egypt, Nigeria, any of these countries can actually, South Africa even, any of these countries can stand like a lockdown of months. It's not possible, given that's a structural restraint. And that's why it's quite concerning.
شكرا عمرو. This has been extremely valuable, وبنحب نحكي معك again مرة تانية. We'd like to speak with you again, hopefully under better circumstances.
Hopefully.
For the sake of securing a good recording and voice, we are gonna stop now. so that we don't encounter more problems, because this usually happens when you and I talk on Skype and we have those other meetings.
Yes.
We get to diminishing returns after 20-25 minutes. So
Yes,
would you like to say something?
شكرا يعطيك العافية.
شكرا كتير عمرو.
Well,
Say
thanks a
hello
lot.
to your wonderful
I
kid who
will.
tried to come into the camera, and your family.
Exactly. Yes.
Salam.
You too, and keep safe, huh? Stay safe.
شكرا كتير. شكرا.